When President Trump sent a high-profile deal request to Beijing, the assumption was simple. China would push back, stall, or signal pressure. That's how these moments usually go. But this time, within hours, China did none of that. Instead, a short public response appeared, calm, measured, almost dismissive, and it spread faster than the deal itself. Not because it was loud or threatening, but because of what it quietly suggested. There was no urgency in the words, no sense of concession, no indication that China was waiting, and that's what unsettled people. Because beneath the calm tone was an implication many didn't catch at first. China may no longer need this deal at all. And if the leverage has already shifted, then this moment isn't really about a deal. It's about power and who realized it first. If you want to see how quiet shifts change real power, you're in the right place. Now let's look at what China's response actually revealed. What made this moment different wasn't just the response itself, but the context surrounding it. For years, these exchanges followed a familiar pattern. A demand would be made, markets would react, officials would posture, and negotiations would stretch quietly behind closed doors. Everyone knew their role. Everyone knew the rhythm. That rhythm created predictability, and predictability created leverage. But predictability only works as long as both sides still need the same outcome. And that's what started to feel different here. The response didn't sound like a country bracing for impact. It sounded like one that had already adjusted its footing, almost as if the real decision had been made long before the request ever arrived. To understand why that matters, you have to step back from the headlines and look at what leverage actually is. Leverage isn't volume, it isn't threats, it isn't how forcefully something is said. Real leverage shows up in timing, in tone, in what someone doesn't rush to do. When a party feels pressure, it moves quickly or defensively. When it doesn't, it can afford to slow everything down. That calm, measured response wasn't accidental. It was strategic. It suggested preparation, and preparation usually means options. What many viewers missed is that this wasn't China reacting in isolation. It was China reacting after months of quiet adjustments, trade routes recalibrated, supply chains diversified, domestic consumption strengthened, and alternative partnerships were tested. None of these moves made dramatic headlines on their own, but together they changed the math. When you reduce dependence, urgency fades, and when urgency fades, leverage shifts. That's why the response landed the way it did, not as a rejection, but as a signal that the pressure many assumed still existed might not carry the same weight anymore. There's also something important about where this response appeared. Not buried in diplomatic language or filtered through intermediaries, it was public, visible, and easy to interpret. That choice matters. It shapes perception, not just between governments, but among investors, allies, and observers watching closely. It invites a question without asking it directly. If this deal doesn't happen, who actually feels the loss first? And once that question enters the conversation, the entire dynamic begins to tilt. But this still isn't the full picture, because the most revealing part of this shift doesn't come from what China said. It comes from why it could afford to say it that way. What makes this situation even more revealing is what didn't happen after that response. There was no scramble to clarify, no immediate walk back, no rush to reassure markets or allies that talks were still on track. In moments where leverage is fragile, silence becomes dangerous. But here, silence felt intentional, almost comfortable. And that alone raised a deeper question. Why wasn't there any urgency to control the narrative? Because urgency usually shows up when the stakes are uneven. When one side believes it needs the deal more, it tries to manage perception. It explains, it softens language, it signals flexibility. None of that appeared here. Instead, the response stood on its own, and the silence that followed allowed it to do its work. It forced others to interpret it, and interpretation is where power quietly shifts. This is where timing becomes more important than words. The response didn't arrive during a moment of weakness. It arrived after months of preparation, during a period when global trade patterns were already adjusting. New agreements had been tested, domestic buffers had been strengthened, and economic exposure had been redistributed. These changes weren't designed for a single negotiation. They were designed to reduce dependency over time. And when dependency decreases, the cost of saying no drops with it. There's a psychological element here that often gets overlooked. Leverage isn't just economic, it's perceptual. It's about who appears to have alternatives. When one side projects calm, It subtly invites the other side to question its own position. That's why the response felt unsettling to so many observers. It wasn't confrontational. It didn't escalate. It simply suggested that the old pressure points might no longer work the way they once did. And this is where the story becomes more complicated, because if leverage has shifted, even slightly, it doesn't announce itself all at once. It shows up in moments like this, small, controlled, almost easy to dismiss, until you realize those moments are becoming more frequent. And when they do, the balance doesn't just change in one deal, it changes across every future negotiation that follows. But there's still another layer here, because the real test of leverage isn't how a country responds to a request. It's how the other side reacts when that response doesn't land the way it was expected to. What came next didn't happen in Beijing or Washington. It happened in the space in between, among allies, markets, and observers who weren't directly involved in the deal, but were watching closely to see how this moment would settle. Because leverage doesn't just exist between two players, it radiates outward. And when it shifts, everyone recalibrates. The response changed how others interpreted risk. Not overnight, but quietly, subtly, and noticeably. When a major power appears unbothered by a deal request that was expected to apply pressure, it forces third parties to reassess assumptions they've been operating under. Assumptions about stability, about alignment, about who has room to maneuver and who doesn't. This is where leverage becomes contagious, not in the decision itself, but in the reactions it triggers elsewhere. Think about what allies usually look for in moments like this. Signals of resolve, signals of control, signals that the balance hasn't slipped. But the absence of urgency introduced doubt, and doubt spreads faster than certainty. If China wasn't reacting the way it used to, then maybe the old playbook wasn't as reliable as it once was. That possibility alone begins to change behavior, quietly, before any official position ever shifts. There's another layer here that rarely gets discussed. Leverage isn't just about power, it's about predictability. When outcomes feel predictable, systems stabilize around them. But when predictability fades, even slightly, risk calculations change. Investors hesitate, partners hedge, and diplomats start asking different questions in private conversations. None of this makes headlines, but it reshapes the environment in which the next move is made. What made this moment especially uncomfortable was that it didn't force anyone to react publicly. It invited private reassessment instead, and private reassessment is where long-term shifts begin. Because once people stop assuming the same outcome, they stop behaving the same way. And behavior is what ultimately decides leverage. This raises a larger question that can't be answered yet. If this response quietly altered how others perceive the balance, then what happens the next time pressure is applied? Will it land the same way, or will it reveal again that the ground has already moved? And if the ground has moved, the real risk may not be losing a deal. It may be realizing too late that the framework you're negotiating within no longer exists. The first visible reaction didn't come wrapped in a statement or a headline. It showed up as hesitation, subtle, almost easy to overlook. A delay where there usually wasn't one. A shift in tone where confidence had been assumed. It wasn't dramatic enough to spark alarm, but it was noticeable enough to change behavior among those paying close attention. This is how leverage often reveals itself in the real world. Not through bold declarations, but through pauses. When expectations are clear, responses move quickly. When expectations fracture, everything slows down. And that's exactly what began to happen. Meetings were postponed, language became more cautious, and references to certainty quietly disappeared from briefings that once relied on it. What mattered wasn't the delay itself. Delays happen all the time. What mattered was why the delay felt different this time. It didn't look like strategy. It looked like recalibration, as if the people on the other side of the table were suddenly unsure which assumptions still held. And uncertainty, once it enters the process, has a way of reshaping every decision that follows. This hesitation didn't require public acknowledgement to be effective. It didn't need explanation. It functioned as a signal to everyone watching that the next move wasn't obvious anymore, that the usual pressure points might not produce the same outcomes. And when that realization sets in, even briefly, leverage begins to operate in reverse. The side that was expected to react now becomes the side being watched. There's a reason this kind of shift is uncomfortable. It removes momentum. Momentum favors whoever is driving the process. When momentum stalls, control becomes ambiguous, and ambiguity forces caution. Caution invites second guessing, and second guessing slows everything down even further. This isn't collapse, it's drift, and drift is far harder to correct than open conflict. The most telling part is that none of this required China to do anything new. The reaction came from elsewhere, from people adjusting quietly to the possibility that the old structure no longer guaranteed predictable results. That's the moment leverage stops being theoretical and starts shaping outcomes, which leads to the next question. If hesitation is already appearing at the edges, what happens when a real decision can't be delayed anymore? When someone has to move first without knowing whether the ground beneath them will hold? And who in that moment is actually under pressure? The next signal didn't come as a statement or a reversal. It showed up as a narrowing of options. A decision that should have moved forward simply didn't. Not canceled, not rejected, just held in place. And that distinction matters because holding something in place is different from stopping it. It suggests uncertainty about what happens next. This is where hesitation begins to turn into friction, because once action is delayed long enough, it starts to limit what's possible. Timelines compress, windows close, choices that were once flexible harden into constraints. And the people making those choices feel it first, long before anyone else notices. What changed here wasn't policy, it was posture. The language around the deal shifted from confident to conditional. Phrases that implied momentum were replaced with phrases that bought time. Time to reassess, time to consult, time to wait and see. That kind of language doesn't emerge unless something underneath has become unstable. This is important because leverage doesn't just influence outcomes. It shapes what feels safe to do. When confidence is high, decisions feel reversible. When confidence weakens, every move feels heavier. That's what friction does. It slows action not because of resistance, but because of risk. And risk forces caution. What made this moment revealing was that the friction wasn't symmetrical. One side could afford to wait. The other couldn't afford to move too quickly. That imbalance quietly redirected pressure, not in a dramatic way, but in a practical one. The side expected to dictate terms now had to account for timing, optics, and second-order consequences. That's a different position to negotiate from. And again, none of this required a declaration. It didn't need escalation. The friction itself did the work. It constrained action. It delayed resolution. It introduced doubt into decisions that once felt straightforward. And once doubt enters, leverage starts to express itself through limits rather than force. This leads to the next question. If hesitation has already become friction, and friction is already constraining action, what happens when the situation demands a clear move? Not later, not eventually, but now. The forced moment didn't arrive with urgency. It arrived with inevitability. A deadline that had been easy to ignore suddenly became visible again, not because anyone wanted to accelerate, but because waiting was no longer neutral. Silence at that point would have created its own consequences. This is where constraint turns into exposure. When a choice can't be delayed without signaling weakness, action becomes less about strategy and more about necessity. And necessity strips away the comfort of ambiguity. Whatever happened next would be read closely, not just for what it achieved, but for what it revealed. The response that followed wasn't bold, it wasn't confrontational, but it was public, and that alone mattered. Because public responses lock positions in ways private ones don't. They narrow future options, commit tone, and invite interpretation. Once something is said openly, it becomes part of the record, and records shape leverage. What stood out wasn't the content of the response, but its restraint. Careful wording, limited scope, no expansion beyond what was required. It did exactly enough to meet the moment and no more. That kind of precision usually signals awareness of risk. Not panic, not confidence, but awareness. The kind that comes from knowing how closely the next move will be examined. This moment revealed something important. The side forced to act wasn't dictating terms. It was managing exposure. That's a subtle but critical difference. Dictating terms suggests control over direction. Managing exposure suggests concern about downside. And when downside starts shaping decisions, leverage has already begun to assert itself. Observers picked up on this immediately, not through headlines, but through tone analysis, through what was emphasized and what was avoided, through what was clarified and what was left deliberately vague. These are the details that matter when leverage is in motion because they show where flexibility still exists and where it's already gone. And now the dynamic had shifted again. Hesitation led to friction. Friction led to constraint. Constraint led to a forced move. Each step narrowed the space for maneuvering. Each step reduced the ability to reset expectations, which raises the next question. If a single forced moment can reveal this much, what happens when multiple forced moments begin to stack? When choices stop being isolated and start forming a pattern? Because once a pattern appears, leverage stops being debated. It starts being felt. The pattern didn't announce itself all at once. It appeared the way most real shifts do, through repetition that feels coincidental until it doesn't. Another moment where action was expected, another situation where clarity would have settled nerves, and once again the response followed the same shape, measured, narrow, public, but carefully contained. This is where observers stop treating the earlier moment as an exception, because repetition changes how behavior is interpreted. One forced move can be explained away. Two begins to suggest adjustment. By the third, the assumption quietly flips. What once looked like temporary caution starts to look like a new operating mode. What mattered wasn't the content of these responses. It was the consistency of the posture behind them, the same reluctance to expand scope, the same effort to limit exposure, the same emphasis on control rather than initiative. Each instance reinforced the last, creating a rhythm that didn't exist before, and rhythms are hard to ignore once they form. This is how leverage starts to feel directional, not through a single outcome, but through accumulated signals. When every necessary move carries restraint, it suggests a narrowing comfort zone. And when comfort zones narrow, choices stop being interchangeable. Some options simply fall off the table, not because they're impossible, but because they've become too costly to risk. The people closest to these decisions would have felt this most acutely. Each response now had precedent. Each statement had a shadow cast by the one before it. That changes how decisions are made, because history starts to constrain the present. You're no longer reacting to one moment. You're reacting to the pattern you're creating. And this is where the balance begins to tilt perceptibly. The side that can repeat the same calm posture without consequence gains something intangible but powerful: credibility, predictability, the sense that it isn't being pulled forward by events, but allowing events to come to it. That's a position of quiet strength, which raises the next, more unsettling question. If a pattern is forming, and one side appears increasingly comfortable letting it form, what does that say about the next moment when urgency truly returns? Because patterns don't just describe the past, they shape how the future will be read before it even arrives. The strain didn't arrive as a shock, it arrived as a test, a situation where the pattern that had quietly formed was no longer optional. Circumstances demanded more than restraint, more than careful wording. They demanded direction, and that's where things became uncomfortable. This moment mattered because it forced the pattern into contact with urgency, not manufactured urgency, but real urgency, the kind that doesn't wait for posture to be perfected or language to be refined. It asked a simple question that couldn't be answered with delay. Would the same measured approach still hold when timing started to matter? What followed wasn't a break from the pattern, but a visible effort to preserve it. The response stayed narrow, the tone stayed controlled, but the space around it tightened. Deadlines loomed closer. External pressures became harder to ignore. And for the first time, the calm posture carried weight, not confidence, but weight. This is what strain looks like in real negotiations. Not collapse, but load. The same structure holding, but under stress, it wasn't designed to absorb indefinitely. Every additional moment of restraint now came at a cost. Each carefully chosen word had to balance two risks at once: saying too much and saying too little. Observers noticed the difference immediately. The pattern was still there, but it no longer felt effortless. It required maintenance, attention, and precision. That shift matters because effort is visible. When calm requires work, it stops signaling freedom. It starts signaling constraint. What's important is that the pattern didn't fail. It adapted. And adaptation is revealing. It tells you where flexibility still exists and where it's already gone. The posture remained consistent, but the margin for error shrank. And shrinking margins change behavior long before outcomes change. This is the point where leverage becomes difficult to fake, because under strain, repetition alone isn't enough. The pattern has to hold under pressure, and when it does, it sends a different signal entirely. Not that urgency is absent, but that urgency is being absorbed. Which leads to the next question. If the pattern can hold even under strain, what happens when pressure intensifies further, when the cost of restraint rises again, and whether the side maintaining that posture is doing so out of control or necessity? Because that distinction changes everything. The next layer of pressure didn't come from the negotiating table. It came from outside it, from the consequences of waiting, from the cost of maintaining restraint as circumstances continued to evolve. Because even the most controlled posture carries a price when it's held long enough. This is where the strain began to translate into tangible cost. Not catastrophic, not headline-worthy, but cumulative. Opportunities delayed don't disappear all at once. They erode, margins thin, alternatives lose freshness. And the longer restraint is maintained under pressure, the more those costs start to surface. What changed here was the calculus. Earlier, restraint felt like a choice. Now it started to look like a commitment, and commitments limit flexibility. They lock you into a trajectory that becomes harder to exit without signaling weakness or reversal. That's when leverage stops being abstract and starts being expensive. This is the point many observers miss because the cost doesn't show up where people expect it. It doesn't announce itself as loss. It shows up as foregone options, as moves that are no longer available without consequence, as decisions that feel heavier than they did before, and weight accumulates quietly. The most telling signal was how carefully subsequent actions were framed. Every word carried more scrutiny. Every adjustment required justification. The posture still held, but it required increasing precision to maintain. That's the sign of narrowing space. When freedom of movement contracts, even strong positions start to feel constrained. What's important is that this cost wasn't one-sided. Pressure was being absorbed, but absorption has limits. The longer urgency is managed rather than resolved, the more energy it consumes. And energy spent maintaining posture is energy not spent shaping outcomes. This is where implication begins to sharpen. If restraint under strain is creating real cost, then the question shifts again. Not whether leverage has shifted, and not even whether the pattern holds, but whether holding the pattern is still serving the same purpose it once did. Because when maintaining control starts to look indistinguishable from avoiding exposure, the difference between strength and necessity becomes harder to ignore. And that brings us to the edge of the story. The moment where the reasons behind the posture matter more than the posture itself. At this point, the question isn't whether the posture worked. It did. The pattern held. The strain was absorbed. The cost was managed. What matters now is why it was possible in the first place. Because strength and necessity can look identical on the surface, but they lead to very different futures. If this posture was born from strength, then restraint was a choice, a deliberate slowing of the process because time itself had become an asset. In that case, every pause carried intention. Every measured response reflected confidence that alternatives existed, that pressure could be absorbed without forcing a concession. That kind of leverage doesn't need to announce itself. It lets others move first. But if the posture was born from necessity, then restraint wasn't freedom, it was containment, a way to manage exposure while options narrowed. In that case, calm wasn't control, it was discipline, and discipline, while powerful, is costly to sustain. It drains flexibility, it consumes attention, and eventually it demands resolution. The reason this distinction matters is because both paths change what comes next. If this was strength, then the leverage shift isn't temporary. It resets expectations for every future negotiation. Pressure loses its immediacy. Deadlines lose their bite. And influence begins to flow toward whoever can wait without erosion. If it was necessity, then the pattern was a bridge, effective in the short term but finite. The longer it's held, the more expensive it becomes, until movement is no longer optional. At that point, leverage doesn't disappear, but it does reveal its limits. And here's the part that most people miss. You don't always know which one it is in the moment. Strength and necessity only separate cleanly over time, through what happens next, through whether restraint continues to buy space or starts to consume it. That's why this moment mattered, not because of the deal that was requested, and not because of the response that went viral, but because of what it revealed about the structure underneath the negotiation. A structure where leverage no longer moves the way it used to. What you witnessed wasn't a rejection. It wasn't a victory. It was a signal. One that suggested the balance may have already shifted, quietly, before anyone was ready to acknowledge it. And the next time a request is made, the most important question won't be how it's answered. It will be whether it still needs to be. If this moment changed how you see power and leverage, I read every comment. I'll see you in the next one.